As you are turning in your Bibles to Proverbs chapter 3, let me just update you on something. The Moldova missions team was scheduled to be arriving tonight at 8:30. That is not going to happen. They were in Toronto. I don't know the exact circumstances, but Whitney had texted Sarah. They had to sit on the tarmac for over 2 hours, go back to the gate, and they were scheduled to leave at 6 in Toronto. So that would, assuming about a 2-hour flight, put them in. They will be flying directly to St. Louis. That would put them there about 8. Baggage and all that stuff. My guess is that they would be back here in Salem sometime around 11, but there is no certainty on that. That's just a guess on my part. But do be praying for safe travels and no more hiccups on their journey back home. But they are they're not in the United States, but they're in North America, and so are on their way back to St. Louis and then back to Salem. So be praying for that. Tonight we'll be in Proverbs chapter 3. And again, Proverbs is just a different book because it's a collection of sayings. Sometimes there is unity in them. Sometimes there is not. There is always truth, and there's certainly always wisdom. But Proverbs chapter 3 is one of the most famous, one of the most recognizable passages in the book of Proverbs, as we are commanded to trust in the Lord with all our heart. It's a verse that is familiar to all of us, but I just want us to think for a moment, because one of the tendencies, one of the ways people have misinterpreted Proverbs over the years is to see Proverbs as some sort of prosperity gospel, right? Because there's a lot in Proverbs: if you do this, then this, and if you follow my teachings, things will go well for you. Blessed is the man who, and things like that. And so a lot of people have appealed to Proverbs as some sort of basis for the prosperity gospel that you hear so much on television. But I think Proverbs is radically different than the prosperity gospel. I think it is fundamentally different, and I want us to look at why and think about that, and then explore the teaching. So look with me here in chapter 3, beginning in verse 1, and we're going to read the first 8 verses. It says, "My son, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments. For the length of days and years of life and peace they will add to you. Let not steadfast love and faithfulness forsake you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart, so you will find favor and good success in the sight of God and man. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. It will be healing to your flesh and refreshment to your bones." Again, you hear this idea: if you do this, then things will go well for you. If you keep my commandments, if you trust in the Lord, then things go well. In some of these prosperity gospel preachers, those who would claim that if we live a righteous life, if we do good things, then good will happen to us, they appeal a lot to Proverbs. But again, as we've said, Proverbs, we cannot take them as promises. They are not intended as promises. We cannot take them as promises. They're general statements of truth. They are God saying this is generally how things work. It's not a guarantee. It's not a promise. Because even sometimes you'll have Proverbs that seem to contradict. And what the writer of Proverbs is doing is he's saying you need wisdom here to see how this applies to your specific situation. But one of the biggest problems with the prosperity gospel is it sees God's blessings exclusively as material and physical, right? That God's blessings are expressed by stuff. God's blessings are expressed by health. God's blessings are expressed in possessions, by promotions. They view the blessings of God as that. I mean, any of these people you watch on television, and I don't really like naming names because sometimes people go, "Oh, I've not heard of them. I need to check them out." But these preachers that you hear, they almost exclusively view them as material. They almost exclusively view them as physical. But Proverbs does not. Because in Proverbs, you have this idea throughout the book that you can have all kinds of money and you can have all kinds of success and you can still be miserable. By the same token, you can have nothing and you can be content in life. You can have bad health, you can have very few possessions, and yet you would still be satisfied. And so one of the biggest deviations between the prosperity gospel and Proverbs is the way that they view that. But the second thing that I think we need to see is the prosperity gospel makes it about what we deserve. Right? Some of the language that you hear so much with the prosperity gospel is sow a seed. Right? You have to sow a seed. If you give your seed faith gift, God will multiply it. I mean, I remember I was watching just flipping through one night, and I saw one of those yahoos on TV, and I thought, I'm going to stop and see what they have to say. And he said, I'll never forget this, because I was irate. He said, now listen, I'm not talking to people who can afford it here. I'm talking to those of you who can't. So God doesn't care if you give out of your excess. He cares if you give what you don't have. He said, if you will give a seed faith gift, God will give you 4 times back. I just thought, heaven help you. I don't know. I'm not even going to speculate about salvation, but even if he is saved, I wouldn't want to be standing near him when he stands before God. But what they do, what the prosperity gospel does, is it makes it so that if we speak something into existence, and you hear that a lot of times, I claim these promises, I have spoken this, there is no merit. Listen, God's promises are not based on whether or not we claim them. God's promises are based on his character, and they're always faithful. God's actions are not determined by ours. And the prosperity gospel makes it so that if we do something, then God reciprocates. If we do something, they'll even use the language of God being bound, God being contractually bound. They talk about a verbal contract. If we speak it, God is bound to do it because of the atonement, right? Next week we'll be in Isaiah chapter 53, and they'll appeal to that. By his stripes we're healed. If we just speak healing because Jesus died, God has to heal us. And so God's blessings, again, which they exclusively view as material and physical, are not his grace, they are his obligation. It's about what we do and how God reciprocates for that. And I think it detracts glory from him in that way. Proverbs, is very different. You notice here in chapter 3 how it begins, my son. As Proverbs is written from Solomon, is from these various authors, a lot of it is to a son, but even deeper than that, this is God speaking to us as his children. This is God offering us fatherly advice. You know, here's the thing. As a dad, I can tell Henry, you need to do chores. Henry, you need to do this. And you know what? He has to do it. It's my house. It's my rules. He has to do it. But I don't just want him to obey me. I don't just want a conformity of action. My job as his dad is to shepherd his heart. And so sometimes I'll bribe him, but sometimes I won't, but I want him to associate, I want him to see good coming from the good actions. And I'll say to him, hey Henry, if you'll keep your room clean this week, then I'll take you to Pizza Inn. Now, I know, look at him. That is not a prompt. I'm just giving an example there, man. I knew he was going to do that. And I guarantee you at some point this week he'll go, hey Dad, remember in your sermon on Sunday night? He won't pick up anything else, but that he'll get. Proverbs shows us something about the very heart of God. God can say, Michael, obey me. Obey me because it's the right thing. Obey me because you need to. Obey me because I'm worth it. Obey me because I created you. God has every right to say that. God has every right to tell me what to do, and I have all the responsibility to obey him. But what Proverbs does is it shows us the graciousness of God, because God says, Michael, obey me, and this is the blessing that'll come from it. Michael, obey me because it's going to be good for you. It's not a guarantee. It's not saying that every single time you obey God, good happens to you. But the Proverbs, the point is that the general pattern of your life is that when you follow God and when you obey God and when you serve God, God blesses you. Now again, we have to think of blessings the way that the Bible defines blessings, and it is not exclusively physical and material. Sometimes it is. But all of us who've lived any amount of time can tell you that the greatest blessing we can have is contentment. You know, I saw the other day Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, was for, I think, like 2 hours this week, the richest man in the world. The Amazon announced a new initiative and stock shot up. And so Jeff Bezos passed Bill Gates as the richest man in the world. And then something happened and stock went down. And like $30 million or whatever billions of dollars were gone just like that. Now, I think, oh my goodness. But he has made no bones about it. Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, they started that pledge years ago that the richest billionaires in the world, they asked each one of them to give away half their fortune. Jeff Bezos says, I'm not doing it. I'm not going to give away. I've earned this. I've made this money. I'm keeping this money. His whole life seems to be about that. And he can have all this money, but when his bank account is fluctuating like that, if his goal is to be the richest man on earth, I mean, for 2 hours he thinks, I've done it, I've made it. Then it's gone again. He's looking from behind at Bill Gates. And the greatest blessing God can give us is a contentment. The word that the Bible uses for it is peace. Again, in the Bible, peace, or in the Old Testament, shalom, it is not the absence of conflict. It's a wholeness. Peace means that there is this wholeness. It means there's a satisfaction. It means that there's a contentment. It means that there's a settledness and a joy. And the book of Proverbs promises, well, it doesn't promise, but the book of Proverbs shows us the only way we can find peace in this life. And that is, he says there in verse 1 and verse 2, he says, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments. For length of days and years of life and peace they will add to you. See, God is saying here to us, he's addressing us as a father, and he's saying, if you want peace, if you want contentment, if you want this great blessing of life, something that cannot be taken away from you, something that does not fluctuate with the stock market, something that is not contingent on a job title, something that is not based on how others view you and what others think about you. If you want peace, here's how you get it. And it says that he gives us personal peace. You see what he says there in verse 1? Do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments. God says if you want to have peace, you've got to pay attention to what I say. You have to think about, you have to meditate on, you have to focus on what I say. He says, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments. And again, one of the problems that we have, we talked about this last week, James tells us that there's two kinds of wisdom that are always competing for us. There is the wisdom of the earth that James calls demonic, and then there is the wisdom from above. And as humans, we're always sort of in between. We're always looking to those two forms of wisdom. And what am I going to buy into? What am I going to base my life on? What's going to shape how I think? What's going to shape how I prioritize things? What determines my value system? And God says here, do not forget my teaching. If you want to have peace, you have to hold on to his teaching. He says, in your heart, keep my commandments. Now again, this goes beyond obeying. The word here that he uses is a word that could be translated to guard or to keep, to protect. And so we have to ask ourselves, what kind of wisdom are we buying into? What kind of wisdom is taking our attention? I guess one of the ways that we can kind of diagnose that question is, let me ask you this. What would make you think you arrived in life? Like, at what point would you say, here I am, this is all that I want? You think, well, I'll tell you, Michael, if I just get this patio built on the back of my house and I get my bass boat, I'll have made it. I don't need anything more than that. Well, if I get a promotion, if this is my job, if I can be vice president, I'm not going to be greedy. I don't want to be president. I'll just be vice president. Maybe you think, well, if I can have this much in my bank account, then I can retire, then everything can be good. See, those questions of what make us feel like we've arrived, what things do we think will give us that satisfaction, that really shows us what kind of wisdom we're listening to. And any of those things, anything of this earth that we base our satisfaction on, anything of this earth we base our contentment on, the reality is it can be taken away from us. Well, if I'll just be happy if I get a good doctor's report. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but one good doctor's report can change in 3 to 6 months. Well, I'll be happy if this happens, if I reach this level, if people look at me this way. All that stuff can change. The writer of Proverbs here, Solomon, he is speaking and he's saying, I need to maintain vigilance over my heart. I need to constantly and intentionally be following God's wisdom. I need to be intentional. Again, here's the thing about wisdom, is it doesn't just happen overnight. It is a lifelong process. Oh, do I wish that I could just tell you, all right, guys, if you just go home and you open up the Bible to Proverbs and you stick it in your pillow tonight, when you wake up, you'll be a little wiser. If we could do that, we'd do it. But that's not how it works. Wisdom is a lifelong pursuit. It is something that we constantly work on. It's something that we have to be intentional about. And the reality is because I am sinful, if I am not intentionally pursuing and guarding my heart to listen to and respond to God's wisdom, my heart is going to drift into accepting the wisdom of the world. And he says that God gives us this personal peace as we seek to follow him and we seek to obey him. But more than that, he gives us a social peace. Look in verse 3. He says, let not steadfast love and faithfulness forsake you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart, so you will find favor and good success in the sight of God and man. Now, notice, what does he say there? Let steadfast love and faithfulness. Right, this is reminiscent of how God introduces himself there in the book of Exodus. It's a God of steadfast love and faithfulness. He says we need to let those things be around us. Right? He uses this language. Bind them around your neck. Wear them like a collar. Write them on your heart. This needs to be integral to who you are. This needs to be a part of your very life. This needs to be you. It needs to be what you're about. He says, as you do this, as you think about God's faithfulness, as you think about God's love, what we are doing is we are staking everything on God's promises. See, a lot of times when we talk about faith, what we mean is faith in a result. So a lot of people speak of it. Well, I've got a doctor's report, but I have faith things will get better. Listen, our faith ought not be in a result. Our faith needs to be in a person. And in my faith is in the faithfulness and in the steadfast love of God. Whatever happens to me and whatever I go through, I'm trusting in him. I'm trusting in what He does and who He is. God alone is faithful. God alone is steadfast. He cannot be moved. He does not change. Man, I'm just so thankful that we don't have to try and gauge what kind of mood God is in each day. Is God in a good mood today? Can I ask Him for something today? Is God in a bad mood today? Do I just need to walk around like a suck egg dog and hang my head and just act like everything's I'm sorry about it? I mean, what a grace it is that we can come to God and we know He is the same yesterday, today, and forever, that He never changes, that He never moves, that we are always with Him. But you see what he says is that when we think of this steadfastness and faithfulness of God, as we make it integral to who we are, look at what happens in verse 4. So you will find favor and good success in the sight of God and man. You know, the only thing the world hates more than Christians are people who profess to be Christians but don't live like it. The world loves to mock Christianity, and when they can find somebody who claims to be a follower of Christ but in no way lives or acts like Him, they are utterly despised. But what the writer of Proverbs is telling us here is when I begin to image God, when I am shaped and molded by His faithfulness and by His steadfast love, not only do I find sight in the favor of God, but I find sight in the favor of men. People around me will like me better the more like Christ I am. People around me will see my integrity more the more like Christ I am. And so God gives us this social wholeness that is totally rooted in me being like Him. He gives me this peace and this contentment, not because of anything I do, but because I am showing Him through me. And He gives us this peace, but He demands something. We have to trust Him. In verse 5, it says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. And do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make straight your paths. We have to trust in God with all our heart. Now, we've all heard this verse. We probably all said this verse. But what in the world does it mean to trust in God with all your heart? What does it mean if we say that we trust in God with all our hearts? Again, we're not talking about being pragmatic. We're not just talking about, well, I'll follow God so long as it works. The word trust here, it has this idea of falling on your face. Trust in God means that He's it for us. He is our only hope. We are jumping out of a plane and we don't have a spare parachute. We are going into battle and we've only got one bullet with us. Like there is nothing else we can turn to. There is nothing else that will save us. To trust in God with all your heart means that He is it. So often, though, we have a pseudo-faith. We have a half-faith where we don't trust in God with all our heart. We trust in God with some of our heart or most of our heart. I mean, you think about it, it kind of manifests itself in any number of ways. A lot of people, they go through life here on earth and they are trying to enjoy earth as much as they can. And you hear even Christians say stuff like, well, I want to have all the fun I can have now because I don't know what heaven's going to be like. But what that statement is saying is, I don't know if God's really truthful. I don't know if heaven's going to be as great as He makes it out to be, so I'm going to have as much fun here. You have some Christians, and they pursue having money all their life because they wonder, will God really meet all my needs? Will He really take care of all of my needs? I don't know if He will. I don't want to find out, so I'm just going to have a nice safety blanket here. I'm going to have the safety net of a nice bank account, and if God doesn't meet my needs, then that's there to take care of me. Some will dabble in other religions. Some will do all sorts of things. But all these things we do are at their core saying, I don't know if God really will do what God says He'll do. I don't know if God really will bless me, take care of me, protect me the way that He says that He will. And so I'm going to do all this stuff. And listen, I'm not advocating being stupid. The story I always tell is there was a guy in Russia several years ago, and he jumped over the fence at a zoo into a bear cage and said, God will save me, and the bear ate him. And I don't advocate Christians doing that. To just say God is going to do something does not mean He'll do it. We ought to be wise. We ought to exercise wisdom and discernment. The question is not about action here. The question is about trust. And if I can only be content if my bank account is above a certain level, that goes beyond being wise. That's about trust. If I can't be generous because it'll take me below that certain level, I'm not trusting in God. If I can't go on a mission trip, even though I feel God calling me to do it because I don't know what it's going to cost me, then my trust is not in God. My trust is in something else. And what the writer of Proverbs is saying here is we need to trust in Him with our whole heart. And God, and I say graciously even though it doesn't feel like that, God graciously puts us in situations sometimes where we have to do that. I love Gideon. I love the story of Gideon because Gideon is the great comic hero of the Bible. Gideon is a coward. Gideon is a wimp. And God uses Gideon in great ways. And you remember the story where Gideon gets all the men of Israel and they still are greatly outnumbered by the Midianites. And God goes, you know what, Gideon, there's too many. I would love to have seen the look on Gideon's face. Too many? We're already outnumbered. And so, thousands go home. And God goes, you know what, Gideon? Still too many. What? God gets it where there's 300. 300. Not the 300 best. It's just 300. God's point is, again, because these men don't even fight. It doesn't matter if they're the best soldiers or not. The point here is God is getting Israel to the point. God is getting Gideon to the point where He says, your only hope is to trust in me. Think of Peter. Peter sees Jesus walking on the water, and Peter goes, man, that'd be cool. And Jesus says, well, come on. And Peter does. Now, here's the thing. We don't walk on water. We don't do that naturally. And what does Peter do? Peter's only hope in that moment is to trust in Christ. His only hope is to be sustained by God. And as soon as Peter stops doing that, what happens to Peter? He stops walking and starts swimming. And so it is that God puts us continually in these situations where we have to trust in Him with all our own heart, but that is an act of His grace. It is His help to us. There's some questions we can ask. Do you let the Bible overrule your own thinking? And one of the great sins we commit sometimes is we read our opinions into the Bible instead of letting the Bible determine our opinions. We come bringing our thoughts and our experiences and we read those into the Bible. And we read the Bible and we say stuff like, well, I know what it says, but. So if you really trust in God with all your own heart, then you accept His word as is because it comes from Him. Another question is, do you believe that people can only have peace with God through Jesus? One of the questions I get asked a lot is, what happens to somebody who never hears about Jesus? Do they go to hell? Listen, here's my answer. is if people can go to heaven for never having heard the gospel, then the greatest gift we can give the world is to stop ever telling anybody about Jesus. Because if we tell people about Jesus, and they weren't going to go to heaven before they heard about it, or they would go to heaven before they heard about it, when we tell them, we've done them a disservice. The only way anyone can have a relationship with God is through Jesus Christ. And to say that people can have a relationship with God by being sincere or by being, to try hard. I mean, that book, there was a book that came out years ago where, somebody, it's a fiction book, but it still was, did horrible violence to the gospel. And God is talking to people, and he says, whatever road you're on in life, I'll find you. And he speaks of people being sincere, and if people are sincere enough, God will find them where they are. Listen, the terrorists who flew the planes into the World Trade Center, they were sincere about what they believed. But they did not believe Jesus was the Son of God. And so they were sincerely wrong. And if sincerity and if effort are what get us into heaven, the reality, if you think that that's how other people can get into heaven, that's probably what you're trusting in yourself to get to heaven by. If you think anybody can get to heaven by effort and sincerity, then that's what you're going to count on, instead of trusting in Jesus alone. Another question we need to ask ourselves is, when's the last time we took a risk to obey God? If I truly am trusting in God with all my heart, then I'm going to need to eventually take some risk where I'm saying, this is going to cost a lot. Stephen Olford, one of my heroes of the faith, great preacher, he coined this phrase. He said, Lord, at any place, at any time, at any cost. That was his prayer to God. He said, God, any place, at any time, at any cost. And quite frankly, a lot of us are afraid to pray that prayer. We're afraid to pray at any cost because there's some cost we're not willing to pay. We're afraid to say any place because there's some places we don't want to go. But if we cannot say that, then we also cannot say we trust in God with all our heart. But it's more than just trusting in God with all our heart. Tied to that, he says, do not lean on your own understanding. God is warning us here against this spirit of self-assurance. The only way I can trust in God with all my heart is if in no way am I depending on myself. The only way I can trust God fully is if I am not trusting in myself at all. I'm not trusting in my efforts. I'm not trusting in my opinions. I'm not trusting in my assessment of the situations, that I trust in God alone. And then he says, acknowledge God in all your ways. Now, what does that mean? I think to acknowledge God in all your ways here speaks of devotion. Perhaps a good picture of it is from Old Testament in the life of Abraham. As Abraham journeys from Ur to where God has him, everywhere Abraham sets up camp, Abraham builds an altar. It's Abraham's way of saying, wherever I am, the only way I'm going to know where to go next is by asking God, is by depending on God and trusting in God. And in everything we do, in big things and in small things, we need to seek God's wisdom. We need to apply his word to our situation. A lot of times we will ask God's wisdom for the big things, but we don't ask God's wisdom for the small things. But Proverbs does not say, in the big ways, acknowledge him. It says, in all your ways, acknowledge him. Years ago, that sort of those bracelets and the phrase, what would Jesus do, came out. I don't know that that's particularly a helpful question. I had some guy ask me one time, he and I were in an argument, and He says, well, what would Jesus do? I say, return with a flaming sword on a horse and judge the world. And he goes, oh, that's what it says he's going to do. There's things Jesus can do that you and I cannot do. The question is not what would Jesus do. The question is, what would Jesus have me do? How can I honor him in this circumstance? How in this decision can I show all my trust is in him? How in the way I speak to this person who drives me insane, how can I show his compassion and his grace? In all my ways, I need to seek to honor him. At every juncture of life, we ask, what would Christ have me do? And then you see what he says. And he will make straight your paths. And the idea here is one of direction. God's going to direct us, and God's going to guide us to the goal he has for us. And the only way I can get where God wants me to be, the only way I can get where God has created me to be, is if I trust in the Lord with all my heart, and I do not lean on my own understanding, and in all my ways I acknowledge him, and he will get me there. And he summarizes this there in verse 7. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. That's it, isn't it? That's life. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. See, it's not just enough to turn away from evil. I have to turn to God, because the reality is if I turn away from evil, I'm just going to replace it with something else. I may not even replace it with something evil, but I'm going to replace it with something less than God. That's why, I don't know if you've ever been to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. I've had the opportunity to go with people before just to see what they're like. You know what everybody at the Alcoholics Anonymous meeting is doing? They're smoking. They're replacing one thing with another. That's what we tend to do. People who are compulsive eaters and then they turn to work out, what do? They are compulsive workouters. They do that. I mean, we just kind of go overboard. And the goal is that not just for me to turn away from evil, it is for me to turn to God, to fear him, to have that right relationship with him that we talked about. And the only way that I can rightly turn away from evil is to turn to God, but the only way I can turn to God is to turn away from evil. I cannot turn to God while still enjoying evil. I cannot turn to God and trust in him with all my heart if I am also buying into the wisdom of the world. I cannot follow him with all my heart. I cannot lean not on my own understanding, and I can't acknowledge him in all my ways if I am also buying into the thinking and the patterns of this world. So God has a path for us. And the only way that we can have that peace that he talks about is when I can trust in the Lord, trust in his commandments, trust in his faithfulness, trust in his steadfast love with all my heart, lean not on my own understanding, and acknowledge him in all my ways by fearing him and turning from evil. And that is the path to wisdom. That is the path to righteousness that God calls us to. Let's go to God in prayer. Father, Lord, we thank you so much for your kindness and your generosity to us in giving us wisdom. God, I pray that we will fear you and turn away from evil. God, I pray that our hearts would have a trust for you, that you would occupy our hearts completely, that it would not be a partial trust, it would not even be a majority trust, but it would be a total trust. We would not trust in ourselves. We wouldn't lean on our own understanding. on our own abilities, on our own wisdom, on our own past, on our own effort. But we would acknowledge you in all our ways. God, I pray that as we continue on this path towards wisdom, that as we do that, you make our path straight. God, thank you for the peace that you give us through obedience. You don't have to do that just because you're gracious, just because you're good to us. God, we thank you for that, and we recognize that. Father, I pray that we would all have a desire to grow in wisdom, that your Spirit would work in us to grow us for your glory, so that people see your faithfulness and steadfast love in us. And it's in the name of Christ that we pray. Amen.